Hey guys, I'm Caleb Giddings from Gun Nuts Media, and today, guess what we're talking about? Revolvers. Of course we're talking about revolvers. It's basically all I talk about anymore, and I'm totally fine with that. Today's video, we're talking about one of the most common myths about revolvers, and one of the reasons that people who recommend revolvers but don't really shoot them a lot recommend them, and that is revolvers don't jam, except for when they do. Now let's unpack this revolvers don't jam misconception. And the idea here is that a revolver is less likely to have a magazine or ammunition induced stoppage than a semi-automatic pistol. And that's true. The magazine is the most common failure point in semi-automatic pistols. Ammunition is another common failure point in semi-automatic pistols. Revolvers are less susceptible to grip pressure than semi-automatic pistols. So all of these things are true. And so this idea that revolvers don't jam, quote unquote, is based in the idea that the revolver is a more mechanically driven weapon. It doesn't need gas pressure to run correctly, it doesn't need recoil to run correctly, it doesn't need magazine springs, etc. So mechanically, that's how the revolver is driven. It's you pull the trigger works against a spring, the spring articulates a lever, the lever turns the wheel, the hammer comes back, the hammer goes forward, the gun goes bang. All of this is true. But the problem with the idea that revolvers don't jam is that revolvers do fail. And when they do fail, it frequently requires tools or something other than just a quick tap rack to get it working again, which I'll show you now.
Are you ready? Stand by.
Yeah, I hit that front one twice. Last one.
Yes, sir. I believe it is.
It
Fifth
is.
spring, correct? All right, this will be a good one. Are you ready? Stand by.
The fuck?
We'll start over.
All right,
Start
hang
over.
on 1 second. Is that gun tied up? Yep, definitely need to brush out under the star next run. Okay.
So you just watched that video and you're probably wondering what in the heck just happened to my gun, and I'll tell you. So I pulled it out of my holster to go shoot it on a Steel Challenge string of fire, and when I pulled the trigger wouldn't go. The cylinder wouldn't turn, nothing was happening. The gun was bound up tight as a drum. And I had noticed when I pushed the cylinder back in before that next string of fire that it went in kind of hard. Normally when you push the cylinder in, it's just supposed to go in and click, be super easy. I kind of had to use some force to push it the rest of the way in there, which told me that, well, what it should have told me was that something was wrong and I should have stopped right there and solved the problem right away. So what happened? Well, what happened was the most common issue you get with revolvers when you shoot them a lot, and that was unburnt powder under the ejector. So this guy right here, this is the ejector star. You press on the rod and it pushes all the naughty empty casings out. And what can happen is you can get flakes of unburnt powder either in here or on here adhering to the surface of that. And what that does is it causes it to sit just a little proud. And it's very, very difficult to see with the naked eye. But when it does that, if it's sitting just a little proud, like so, and that cartridge isn't fully seated, you're gonna have to push it in and it's not gonna feel right. And then when you go to pull the trigger, it's not gonna work. So that's the most common thing that happens to wheel guns, dummy round, when you shoot them for high round counts. And the easiest way to fix that is a trick that a lot of old-timer revolver guys used to do. So back in the day when cops shot revolvers for their quals, a lot of the old-timey revolver guys, or just cops back then, would keep a toothbrush in their back pocket. And in between strings of fire, they would pop the ejector up and they would go brush real quick and let it go and load the gun and go about their next string of fire. And if you shoot revolvers a lot, if you shoot a lot of high round counts out of revolvers, you have that toothbrush, you keep that on you. And what I did, I had not brought my toothbrush with me, so I just very quickly swept out from under there with my bare hands. I got the crud and I restored the gun to function. So that's the most common failure point with a revolver when you shoot it a lot. But it's not the only one. So one of the other things that can happen with revolvers when you shoot them a lot, especially Smith & Wesson revolvers, is if you don't have the strain screw Loctited in here on the inside of the gun, after 1,500 rounds or something like that, it might have started to back out. And all of a sudden, you're going to start getting light primer strikes. And if that happens, you are in... well, you're in trouble, because you're going to have to take your grips off, you're going to have to get a screwdriver, and you're going to have to tighten that thing down. And the point of this is just looking at these two common failure points with revolvers when you're shooting them for high round counts is to illustrate the fact that while revolvers are very, very tolerant of neglect, they're not very tolerant of abuse. And what I mean by that is, let's say I didn't have this red dot on here. Let's say this is just a regular old revolver with an iron sight. I could load this with all 7 rounds and throw it in a sock drawer for 20 years and pull it out of that sock drawer and it would fire. 100% it would fire. I can't necessarily say that about a semi-automatic pistol. In 20 years, maybe the magazine spring's given out. Maybe one of the other springs that's under pressure in the gun has given out. I don't know. And I don't think anyone's ever actually done that experiment, but revolvers are very tolerant of neglect, but they're not very tolerant of abuse. And when they do break, when they do jam, quote unquote, it often requires more than just a quick tap rack bang to fix. It requires a tool. It requires you to use your hands. It requires something other than a simple malfunction clearance that you can do with a semi-automatic pistol. So I love wheel guns. Everybody knows I love wheel guns. I love this wheel gun a lot, but they're not perfect. And it's important to understand their shortcomings. It's important to understand their weaknesses, especially if you're going to carry one. That powder under the ejection star was the first time I'd had that failure in a really, really long time. And part of it was because I had just cleaned this gun and there was a little bit of oil residue left on the cylinder, which I didn't get when I wiped it off. And I should have test fired it before I took it out to a match, but I didn't. And I learned my lesson right then and there. So remember, guys, it's not that revolvers don't jam. Revolvers are less likely to have a mechanical failure than a semi-automatic pistol, absolutely. But when they do fail, it's a big problem. I'm Caleb Giddings. Thanks for watching.